Hey guys, welcome to Hit the Deck. I'm Will, and today I'll be talking to you about my mono black artifacts deck with a hint of life gain, helmed by Anrakyr the Traveller. Okay, so first things first, let's read through the commander Anrakyr the Traveller. Anrakyr is a 4/4 for 4 and a black, and the card reads, whenever this card attacks, you may cast an artifact spell from your hand or graveyard by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So there's some important stipulations within that text there that are going to be important in terms of how the deck's put together. But before we get into those, I just quickly like to go through the main aims of the deck and kind of what the deck wants to do in the early game, the mid game, and the late game. So the first thing may not be a surprise to anyone. The first thing that the deck really wants to do in the earlier turns is to put out some ramp into Anrakyr the Traveller. So as a 5 mana commander, that feels, quite expensive. If you're paying life to cheat out powerful artifacts, if you're already paying for what is essentially quite an expensive artifact, it really helps the deck run if we can get Anrakyr out a bit earlier than turn 5, because obviously the card needs to attack, and if it comes down 5, attacks turn 6, and you're playing essentially a 6-drop artifact on turn 6, we're not really ramping. With that in mind, the deck looks to ramp into an attack from Anrakyr to play out an impactful artifact, essentially. So the first aim is to ramp into Anrakyr. The second aim is to survive an attack. Now, when I was making this deck, I initially was a little bit hesitant. I looked at an Imotech perhaps as the first commander that I was going to try for this this style of mono black artifacts deck. Imotech's a really cool commander, but there was a reason that I was a little bit reluctant to go for Anrakyr. One was the 5 mana value cost. It's quite an expensive cost. But the other thing is that Anrakyr has to attack in order to get this ability to be able to play an artifact from hand or graveyard by paying life, essentially. And I kind of thought that Anrakyr, as a 4/4, a 5 mana 4/4, kind of needed menace, really. It could kind of have done with menace to be able to get through and make this attack. However, the second aim of the deck is actually sensitive to this drawback, and actually by not having any evasion, I think kind of makes the deck a little bit more of an interesting challenge. And what I mean by this is the second aim is that Anrakyr has to survive an attack. This is not a combat damage trigger. This is, you'll go to declare attackers, and you will declare Anrakyr as an attacker, and then a triggered ability will go on the stack. And you will, before any attacks happen, you will get the ability to play an artifact from hand or graveyard for life equal to its mana value. That's how the ability works. And actually, that's quite interesting because that means that the artifact comes into play before any damage happens. And actually, what I've found in playtesting and researching the deck is that the most important thing is that Anrakyr survives the attack. Not necessarily that the card gets in for loads of damage, or that the card can die, right? If you have something like a Malakir rebirth to bring it back to the battlefield tapped or something like that, right? So the importance is not necessarily on getting through, but surviving. So I have, and that's one of the reasons that important distinction, I think, is one of the things that actually makes Anrakyr quite an interesting commander. But it's also one that I've kind of allowed for in the deck building process. There's more recursive pieces than, for instance, there's a sort of +1/+1 counters sub theme going on in there as well, and it's kind of to make Anrakyr more survivable rather than just putting out raw damage. So that's kind of the second aim. It's not necessarily that Anrakyr gets in for an attack. It's that combat is survived in a way. Another thing that worked well here during the playtesting is, again, I'm going to talk a little bit about permanent base removal that is really useful for the deck, and it's one of the things that it wants to be doing. But I think it's important that we talk about permanent base removal coming down before attacks and removing a blocker. So, maybe double blocking becomes really unfavorable. And you can make those blocks unfavorable and, essentially keep Anrakyr alive. So that's the second aim. And then the third and final aim, if you like, that was the mid game. This is the late game. The final aim is essentially to win the game with kind of life-gainy combos. This was a kind of late addition to the deck building process. I found that I had lots of sort of recurable removal pieces, and I was able to sort of control the board quite well with earlier iterations of the deck. But actually, it didn't really, the biggest creature is a Cityscape leveler, I think, in there. It's an 8/8 with trample, which is strong, but it's not going to, win the game out of nowhere that easily. So I essentially thought, well, what is a good way to essentially add win cons that fits with the kind of spirit of the commander, if you like. And Anrakyr is using life as a resource. So, a mono black deck, there's no surprise that this deck too uses life as a resource, and that kind of explains, an enduring tenacity or something else that's essentially in the deck. And your sort of win cons are largely geared to that idea. So that's the three main aims of the deck. And I'm just quickly now gonna go through some of the main stats that essentially give you an idea in a numerical sense, in a quantifiable sense, of what the deck's trying to do. Okay, so a quick look at some of the stats. The first one that I've got down here is essentially an attack enabler. I called it an attack granter because I was having a bit of a rough day and I forgot that enabler was a very useful word for discussing play pieces and magic cards and stuff. So attack enablers, this category is important because it kind of fulfills that second aim of the deck in that Anrakyr can attack and survive. It's important. We have 12 of those, and interestingly, they actually keep Anrakyr alive in inverted commas. Being a Necron and all, they keep him on the board in an interesting range of ways. And we'll go through that in more detail shortly. 3 board wipes. I kind of think that their name is Death is the best one because it's a asymmetric board wipe. But Living Death and Portal are kind of in their own way. They're sort of two kind of half board wipes. Obviously, Portal is devastating, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But three board wipes. I think that's kind of enough for the deck. Card advantage, so there's 13 sources of cards that replace the card itself when it's on the field and also give you several more cards in hand. When these cards are in play, you should have a full hand, essentially. I think for more Revolt's probably quite a generous include there, but it's generally, these are the ones that keep your hand full. And there are 13 examples of that, so about what I'd want, really. Just over 10% of the deck is dedicated to card advantage, and there's some really good sort of burst draw in there. Peer into the Abyss, Altar of the Wretched, Morbid Curiosity. These can draw you 6, 7, 8 cards at once. So that's something that I generally like to put into decks, and that is where we're at with card advantage. Card selection. A similar story, 13 of them. I've included Mill under this bracket because the commander Anrakyr lets you cast an artifact from your graveyard. So given with the caveat of your commander being out, milling a card with a flayed one or a Necron Deathmark, that can be real advantage, and that can be something that can really allow you to sort of swing the tide in the game, essentially. 2 pieces of graveyard hate. We'll talk a little bit more about them later. And then there are 2 haste enablers, which are essentially here so that to prevent that thing that Anrakyr does where it comes down on turn 4 or 5 and has to attack next turn. It's quite telegraphed. So, I've chosen haste enablers based on the idea that they are 2 mana and no more. That's why I ultimately cut Swiftfoot Boots. It might be a mistake, whatever, but I like 2 mana for haste. and 2 mana straight away to be able to sort of craft it into your curve. These pieces worked really well in testing. I have 11 life gain pieces, and a lot of the sort of win cons appear in this section. So, you know, a big exsanguinate can be really, you know, it's a sort of mono black staple win con, as is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is a mono black artifacts deck, but I've included Grey Merchant because it's so efficient at gaining life and really sort of making the most of those life gain synergies of closing out games. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I mentioned the +1/+1 counter kind of sub theme. It is a bit of a sub theme, and you know, we'll come back to it. But these are essentially here to facilitate Anrakyr survival, that second aim of the deck, and I believe they do that reasonably well. 13 pieces of ramp. I feel like if you're superstitious, this is quite an unlucky deck with all the 13s. But having that kind of, you know, just having these sections just a touch over 10%, you know, makes the deck feel like it's doing the things that it needs to do, and there's sort of plenty of ramp in there as well. 11 recursive pieces that all, you know, if something's removed, it's quite easy to get back. Obviously, the commander does that as well, so it's a really quite resilient recursive deck. And 10 pieces of removal. A lot of these are permanent based, which is essentially what the deck wants to do, but they, you know, I think 10 is a good level, particularly when you can reuse a lot of these, you know, Cityscape level attacks and can take out something else. So that's really good. And 12 sack outlets. You know, it's important to make sure that when you have an ETB and you want to reuse it, that you have a way of getting it off the battlefield so you can bring it back on again. You know, I found that 12 is, again, quite a good level for that. A couple of token generators. These are just here because they're kind of Necron cards and they happen to tokenate. They tokenate. They happen to generate tokens in that sense. It's not really part, you know, a deliberate part of the deck's construction. And 5 tutors, but the reason why I've included these tutors is because they're quite narrow. So Urza's Cave and Expedition Map only gets lands, and Buried Alive only gets creatures to the graveyard, and Forgemaster only gets artifacts, which is essentially what the deck's built around. So that's kind of why there's quite a few tutors in there. I've got Roaming Throne in here just because it kind of doubles up everything you want to do. It's not strictly a tutor, but it kind of, because it's so kind of versatile, it sort of feels a bit like a tutor at times. And then the win cons, we have 8 examples of that that sort of work together in various different ways that we'll get into shortly. So I'm now going to move on, having been through the numbers and the amount of, you know, the sort of the makeup of the deck, how it's composed. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm essentially going to pick out an exemplar card for each of these sections and kind of justify it in terms of why this particular artifact-based, you know, removal piece is really important in this deck. So in terms of attack enablers, I initially tried to make this deck as a kind of a Voltron deck, where it would be the pieces of equipment that you could essentially play with Anrakyr's ability. But because what happens when you go to declare attackers, you declare Anrakyr as an attacker, you know, you cheat a piece of equipment into play, unless that piece of equipment is like a Hammer of Nazan, or you know, something that says when it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature. You can't equip the piece of equipment at instant speed, so essentially you have to equip the equipment in the second main. And you know, if you've already played Anrakyr on turn 5, attacked on turn 6, that means you're not getting, you know, an equipped attack till turn 7, and you know, that's quite a feasible outcome. So I quite quickly realized that equipment kind of didn't fit quite as well as it first seemed it might. So my question then was, well, what will come down in that, you know, once attackers are declared and you get the trigger from Anrakyr and you put a piece, put an artifact into play, what triggers well there? And I sort of settled on In playtesting, I realized that Cage Sun, one of my favorite artifacts ever, feels really good in this situation, right? Paying 6 life to put down, to cast a Cage Sun in the declare attacker's step, and it has this static ability of creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1. So you pay 6 life for a Cage Sun, you choose black, and essentially Anrakyr becomes a 5/5. And in testing and having played this deck a couple of times, a 5/5 seems significantly more survivable than a 4/4, right? If you attack with a 4/4 and it's double blocked, there's a good chance it sort of won't. There's a good chance they can take it with them, right? But suddenly a 5/5, that extra point of toughness felt relevant in testing, and it, even if I kind of got to this point, if you do pay 6 life for a Cage Sun, it tends to be worth it in a way. You've doubled your mana. Like, you could probably cast Anrakyr again with a reasonable estimate of 12 black mana, right? You're able to just cast your commander again. You've got plenty of mana there with the Cage Sun. But this Cage Sun, I think, for those of you who aren't familiar with Cage Sun, it's an artifact for 6 generic mana. It reads, as Cage Sun enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1. Whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana of that color. So it's Cage Sun, yeah, because it's a cool ramp piece. It works well in the deck. This is the Necron Dynasty art style, which just makes it really aesthetically cohesive, and it ramps you. It makes Anrakyr that bit more survival, and it kind of stands in my mind in terms of attack enablers. It kind of stands for a particular kind of card. So also the Immortal Sun, another artifact, Sun, 6 generic mana. It reads, players can't activate planeswalkers, loyalty abilities, not that relevant generally. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card, a nice bit of extra card advantage there. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, a little bit of ramp. Creatures you control get +1/+1. So that sort of static +1/+1 ability with a bit of something extra, these are the kind of cards that you want to cast off Anrakyr's ability first time round. And if you can ramp Anrakyr out on turn 4, maybe you have a haste enabler. If you don't, getting one of these down on turn 5 and having access to loads more mana or an extra card at the beginning of your turn, that in testing, that feels really good. Eldrazi Monument's another good example of this. These are the kind of cards, they give you a static buff to your commander, so he's that bit more survivable, and a bit of something else. That's the sort of archetypal card I want for my attack enablers. I'm now going to move on to board wipes, apparently, because I think these are in alphabetical order. So in terms of board wipes, I've written down Portal to Phyrexia here. Portal to Phyrexia is a 9 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from graveyard onto the battlefield in your control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So just honestly a generically good card in artifact decks, but often that 9 mana price point is a bit of a deterrent for a lot of decks. Anrakyr essentially says, just pay 9 life and you will get this. It's a board wipe in spirit almost. The sacrifice gets around things like indestructible and hexproof, and that they have to sacrifice 3 creatures means that they can keep their best thing, but all the other stuff is gone. And it also has that kind of it's an artifact that brings something back. If it gets rid of all the blockers, if you can cheat this down in when you first attack with Anrakyr, it makes your attacks very favorable, more favorable, I think, than your opponents will be banking on. And if Anrakyr does somehow happen to still die, if there still is someone that you're attacking that after sacrificing 3 creatures still has a board state strong enough to be able to kill Anrakyr, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put it back into play. Admittedly, it won't be able to attack on that turn, but it's an artifact piece that's recursive, and that's kind of what I want from board wipes. Same with Living Death. There's plenty of creatures. There's 30 creatures in the deck. Living Death can be a real asset. And then Name is Death. Again, probably one of the best cards in the deck. Destroy all non-artifact creatures. It's essentially a one-sided asymmetrical board wipe for the most part. And I've just felt this card really sort of win games, and it's really thematic, and it's just a nice strong card. So that's what I want from board wipes. There's 3 of them. Now going to move on to your kind of archetypal card advantage, and I'm quite excited about this next one because I don't see loads of people talking about it. Hover over Bolas' Citadel there. Honorable mention. Obviously, it's great. You guys will know it's great. But the archetypal card in terms of card advantage for me in this deck is Altar of the Wretched, which is 2 and a black for an artifact that reads, when Altar of the Wretched enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a non-token creature. If you do, draw X cards, then mill X cards, where X is that creature's power. You can craft it with 1 or more creatures, which generally isn't that doesn't come up that often, but there is you can do that, but you can also, if it's in the graveyard, you can pay 2 and a black to return it to your hand, which can be quite good for sort of recurring this card if you can find a way to sacrifice an artifact and then pay 3 and then play it again. Often even paying 6 mana to sacrifice something and draw 5 cards tends to feel pretty good. So that's kind of my point with this card. It feels like paying 3 mana to sacrifice a creature and draw cards equal to its power is a good rate anyway. Disciple of Bolas, I think, is 4 mana and gains you some life. But that I've kind of got the altar in here instead of that, just because of the cheaper price point and the sort of extra versatility of being able to pay some mana and recur it to your hand if you mill it or if you're able to sacrifice it. But the thing that really kind of feels quite excellent about this card is you draw and then you mill. And with Anrakyr's ability, you kind of still have access to all of the artifacts you mill. So it really feels quite broken in a sense that you draw X and then you mill X. And in a lot of cases, you've drawn more than X. Based on the composition of the deck and the amount of artifacts that are put within it. There are some good targets for Altar of the Wretched that I decided to put in here quite intentionally. So I'm just trying to find some of those. Phyrexian Flesh Gorger. This is a really good target if it is in its 7 power prototype form. That's essentially 3 mana, sacrifice that, you draw 7, you mill 7. You're seeing 14 cards there essentially for 3 mana. That's a really cool rate. Kyrich can get quite large in this deck. Whenever you cast a black spell, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and if as many of the cards as possible in the deck are black, so that Kyrich can sort of facilitate them being played. And for that reason, Kyrich can get quite big, can be quite a good target for this. And there was where's the leveler? I can't find Cityscape leveler. There he is. This is the man who hates cities. This is an 8/8 for 8 with trample. When you cast a spell, whenever it attacks, destroy 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a tap Power Stone token. It has Unearth for 8 generic mana. 3 mana, sack this, draw 8, mill 8, and then pay 8 life to recast it again with Anrakyr if you're attacking. That's the kind of thing this deck wants to be doing. That's when it's sort of really in full flow. And having done that in a game, that is, you feel like you've solved the case. You really feel like you're part of the game, and that's what deck building is all about. So thinking of card advantage, Altar of the Wretched, really, really cool. Obviously, there are other good examples of this in the deck. Peer into the Abyss, which draws half of your library at the cost of half your life. It's kind of in the spirit of the deck, paying life for resources. So we'll now move on to card selection. And the card selection kind of archetype is Ransack the Lab. I've found that this kind of card selection feels really effectively priced in the deck. So Ransack the Lab is a sorcery for 1 and a black. It reads, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So this can be really useful if you're going to miss your land drop, and you can pay 2 mana essentially to look at the top 3, put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, because you essentially put the artifacts into your graveyard, given that your commander can cast them later, and you can take the land to hand. That's something that can be really useful as well. Ripples of Undeath, just I think a black graveyard deck kind of staple. There's a similar sort of thing. 1 and a black, excuse me, for an enchantment. It reads, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3, then pay 1 mana and 3 life. If you do, put 1 of the milled cards into your hand. So that's a really neat way. Again, because it's any card, you can get lands, you can get a mana rock to sort of boost into Anrakyr. Really useful. And Warlock class does a similar sort of thing at level 2 when the class becomes level 2. So for a total of 1 and 2 black, essentially, you look at the top 3. It's the same effect as Ransack the Lab, but that particular effect for 2 or 3 mana is the kind of card selection I think that this deck wants, particularly in the early game, right? In that kind of development phase where you're either putting down mana rocks or playing this kind of ability, a Ripples of Undeath or a Ransack the Lab, where you're essentially taking the land you need and putting some artifacts away for later. That feels like really nice setup. That's the kind of card selection that this deck wants to be partaking in. The next section, Graveyard Hate. So I think I could talk about both of these cards being exemplars for Graveyard Hate. Obviously, there's only 2 of them because you don't always necessarily meet it in a particular matchup. But Agatha's Soul Cauldron, I think, is a really interesting play piece in this deck. And the reason for that, first and foremost, is because it's efficient. It's 2 mana and it can exile target card. Okay. Sorry, just to go over what Agatha's Soul Cauldron does. It's 2 mana for a legendary artifact. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. And you can tap it to exile target card from a graveyard. When a creature is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So what I really like about this in terms of how it interacts with graveyards is that you can do it instant speed. You can keep the artifact untapped, so there's that threat of activation, where someone says, the other graveyard deck might say, I'm going to reanimate, the Lord of Pain, and I'm going to cast Reanimate for 1 black. And you can say, in response to that, I'll tap the Soul Cauldron, exile that card, and then, Reanimate essentially fizzles in that case. And you feel really intelligent. But yeah, seriously, this is a really cool utility piece. I'm going to talk about some interesting interactions that this card has with the rest of the deck a bit later. But you can keep that threat of activation open, and you can also use it to put a +1/+1 counter on Anrakyr at instant speed when the card attacks, to give a little bit more survivability, to make it from a 4/4, 5/5, 6/6, just to add that extra counter to give it a little bit more beef, as it were. The next category is Haste Enabler, and I want to talk about a very particular card in this deck. And as an exemplar card, I don't know. I don't love how Crashing Drawbridge looks in this deck. He's probably a nice boy, but it looks a bit goofy. Like he's just a door. But that said, I've tried it. I've tested the deck with and without Crashing Drawbridge, and generally playing it on turn 2 and having it as a blocker in the early stages of a game, and then when you play Anrakyr, whether it's turn 4, 5, or 6, or even later, maybe it's not going too well, being able to tap Crashing Drawbridge and just get that Anrakyr's ability in effect straight away just feels really neat. Lightning Greaves obviously does a similar sort of thing, but everyone knows about Lightning Greaves. Like, it's obviously good. Crashing Drawbridge is, it can feel a bit dead when you draw it later in a game. But certainly earlier in the game, it's important. It's an artifact creature as well, so if you really want to turbocharge your turn where you play Anrakyr, you can always tutor for it with both Kuldotha Forgemaster and Buried Alive. Yeah, I was just making sure it was called Buried Alive there. But it's a certainly a tutorable piece, which serves quite a specific function within the deck. So that's the haste enablers. Sorry if I've been mean to crashing Drawbridge. I do like the card. I wish it looked a little more cohesive. I feel like the aesthetic of this deck is really nice and cohesive. And then there's a Drawbridge, and he's crashing into you. So yeah, they're the haste enablers. Life gain. The card that I have as the exemplar for life gain is obviously with Erebos. This is just I think one of my favorite cards ever. I want more copies of it just because I'm like, I can put that into a deck. Whip of Erebos is 2 and 2 black for a legendary enchantment artifact. It reads creatures you control have lifelink, and you can play 2 and 2 black and tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. So this essentially is doing everything the deck wants to do. It's an artifact. It gives creatures you control lifelink, so it's gaining you loads of life, and it's bringing other creatures back from the graveyard to the battlefield. So it kind of typifies what the deck is trying to do. And it can really facilitate those quite large bursts of life gain that, an enduring tenacity, for instance, can really kind of weaponize, and you can swing all your creatures at one person, do however much damage there, and then all of that life gain can be pointed somewhere else with enduring tenacity. And you can really kind of amp up that damage, essentially. I do think it's worth mentioning the card's safety valves, as it has two. I think it's a shame that you can't sacrifice the thing you bring back before the exile at the beginning of the next end step clause kicks in, because of the replacement effect. If it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead. It's essentially the unearth clause that means you can't sacrifice it to another ability, put it back in the graveyard, and sort of circumvent the first part of the ability. It basically says when this thing comes back, when it goes again, it's gone forever, which is, it's probably just as well. I think it's a very strong card as it is, but I would like to be able to work around that. That would make me feel satisfied when playing the game. It also has the sort of sorcery speed only clause on it, which I can understand why that's there. But mind you, if you're sinking 8 mana essentially into something, I feel like you should be able to put that into play at instant speed. I feel like it wouldn't be unreasonable. But despite those two sort of caveats, I think this card's amazing. It's exactly what the deck wants to do. You always feel good when you draw it, and it's kind of cool as well. If Anrakyr does go, goes into his, you declare him as attacker, and he is kind of double blocked or killed with a Death Toucher. If you have Whip of Erebos in play, you can know that you can tap for, get your commander back into play, attack with it, and because your commander's exiled, you're essentially circumventing command attacks once there if you put them into grave afterwards, so long as the Whip of Erebos doesn't get removed. It's quite a nice sort of resilient move to have there. I think this is a really important card in the deck, and I feel like that is, it's sort of plain to see. It gains life. It's a mono black artifact, and it can bring things back. What's not to love there? So +1/+1 counters. This is very much a sub theme in the deck. Generally in deck building, I kind of usually like to have a high level of focus than I think this deck has. But that said, of these 5 cards that deal with +1/+1 counters, 4 of those 5 are artifacts themselves. So, it's a sub theme, but it's certainly contained within the sort of artifacts sort of overarching theme, if you like. So the +1/+1 counters here are essentially they're kind of an extra an extension of this attack granter section, really. They're here to add a bit more survivability to the commander, Agent of the Shadow Thieves. Specifically puts +1/+1 counters on your commander and gives it indestructible and death touch when it's attacking the opponent with the most life, which is really useful. But the card I wanted to talk about here was Steel Overseer, just given that, it's an artifact creature. It's kind of what the deck is about, what it likes to do. You can tap it to put +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. So it's really good. Your Anrakyr comes down on turn 5, puts a +1/+1 counter, attacks the next turn. It's got 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and your board is generally just a little bit stronger with Steel Overseer. It certainly improves the attacks you have on board, and all for the cost of 2 mana. I don't think many of your opponents will be like, I feel really good. Beast Withinning. That's definitely an adjective. Beast Withinning a Steel Overseer because obviously the mana trade is not very good there. I think the +1/+1 counter theme is a sub theme, but a lot of these cards are very efficient, with the exception of Triskelion, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's kind of here for another cool interaction that involves these 2 cards and this card, but we'll get to that. That's the +1/+1 counter sub theme. It's kind of really just an attack enabler. Now I'm going to talk to you about how the deck ramps. So there are a couple of options here. Obviously, Solemn Simulacrum, 4 mana for an artifact creature. When it enters, put a basic land from your library into play taps, shuffle. When it dies, draw a card. Love that in this deck. The example I have written down is Cage Sun, but I feel like I spoke to you about Cage Sun, and I really like Cage Sun. Obviously, it doubles your mana. That's great ramp. But again, a kind of generically good card, but Dark Ritual does a real good job of getting those sort of turn 3 and turn 4 Anrakyr plays up and running essentially, and it kind of feels like a 1-turn Soul Ring. That's the kind of sort of tempo boost you get from it, and I think doubling the chances of this really makes the possibility of getting Anrakyr's ability firing on turn 4 significantly more likely. And Phyrexian Tower, also a very good card. You can sacrifice a creature to tap for 2. These kind of 3 are the cards you want to see in your opening hand to really, because one of the weaknesses of the deck is that Anrakyr is a 5 mana commander, right? You kind of need to play this card before turn 5. Equally, if Anrakyr dies, it's then 7 mana, and that starts to feel really, really difficult to pay if you don't have a Cage Sun in play. I'll stop talking about Cage Sun in a minute, but I just thought it was worth mentioning that it's actually probably the earlier accelerants that are most important to particularly that first aim of the deck to ramp into Anrakyr, and I thought they were certainly worth mentioning. Okay, so in terms of recursion, another category we're going to talk about. I'd like to choose Technomancer as the exemplar card. So Technomancer is 5 and 2 black for an artifact creature Necron Wizard. It reads, when Technomancer enters the battlefield, mill 3, then return any number of artifact creature cards with total mana value 6 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. It's a 5/1. So this just kind of does a bit of everything. It's expensively priced, but it's priced in terms of mana, so we're clear. But it lets you see more cards, and it returns artifact creatures, sometimes up to 3, right, from the graveyard to the battlefield. So it can be really, really useful when paired with, something like, where is my friend? Well, Imhotep Stormlord. Sometimes you can have 3 or 4 if you cast Technomancer from the graveyard. That's 1 artifact leaving, so you make 2 Necrons, and then the artifact creatures that this card reanimates essentially all happen at the same time, so you only get 1 other trigger of Imhotep's ability, but essentially you can get 4 tokens quite easily with this card if one of the if you have it on the battle, if you have Imhotep on the battlefield, Imhotep the Stormlord on the battlefield already. So I just think this is a great example of a recursive. It's an artifact creature. Obviously, it's a Necron, so it's really, really cohesive with the vibe of the deck. And I've had turns with this when Roaming Throne's been on, and it's been doubling its triggered abilities, and the artifact creatures that I'm returning are Necrons as well. I'm going to be talking about this interaction in a bit more detail later in the video. So Technomancer is my favorite piece of recursion. Obviously reanimates here, that's really good. We've already spoken about Portal to Phyrexia. So there's some really, really good recursive pieces in this deck. Moving on to removal. In terms of removal, like I mentioned earlier, I want as much permanent based removal as on artifacts, essentially. So artifacts that enter and remove something or a couple of things. That's the archetypal piece of removal that this deck wants. And to kind of sum that up, I've chosen to talk about Noxious Gearhulk, which is a 4 and 2 black for an artifact creature construct with Menace. It reads, when Noxious Gearhulk enters, you may destroy another target creature. If a creature is destroyed this way, you gain life equal to its toughness, and it's a 5/4. So this is, again, similar to Whip. This is everything the deck wants. It's recurable, it gives life gain, and it's a good attacker as well. And if there's something with a lot of toughness in play that you can get rid of with this card, you can get quite a bit of life back. Given that this deck is quite life hungry, it uses its life as a resource. That's a fundamental play pattern of the deck. Noxious Gearhulk can get rid of something and restore you some life in that sense, which is why I've picked that as the Exemplar removal piece. Moving on to sack outlets, I have written down essentially the Kuldotha Forgemaster as a sack outlet because it's kind of a tutor and a sack outlet. I'll read it for you. It's 5 generic mana for an artifact creature construct. You can tap it and sacrifice 3 artifacts to search your library for an artifact card and then put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So what people sometimes miss about this card is that it doesn't have to sacrifice itself, right? You can tap it and sack 3 other artifacts, or you can include this card in, if you only want to sack 2, you can sack this and 2 others to search your library for an artifact card and then put it onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. It's a tutor to the battlefield for any artifact, which, this being an artifacts deck, there's a lot of good artifacts that you can literally just get straight into play. And you will get 3 dice triggers, which could be useful for some of the cards in the deck, such as, where are we? I know the card, the Psychomancer, right? When another non-token artifact is put into a graveyard, you can drain your opponents a little bit with that and get some extra sort of functionality there. But yeah, the Forgemaster can also be activated at instant speed. Once you get it down after that first turn, you're able to tap it. I like to use it as late as possible to really sort of activate it on someone else's turn, or in response to like a creature board wipe and get a non-creature artifact. Those kind of functionalities really make it what I see as an important sacrifice outlet for the deck. So moving on, there's token generators. These are kind of incidental. I'm not going to commit a whole section to this. The deck's not really trying to make loads of tokens, although it can do with these cards, right? And that's just, like I say, kind of incidental. I'm going to move past this particular example. And in terms of the tutors, I've just spoken about Kuldotha Forgemaster. It's really, really good, but for this section, I kind of want to draw your attention to the land tutors, and this is because the deck plays Phyrexian Tower. I think the deck is always stronger if it has a Phyrexian Tower in play. So whether we're using an Urza's Cave, which is a land, Urza's Cave taps to add colorless, and you can pay 3, tap and sacrifice it to search your library for any land and put it into play. Just a generically good utility land there. And then Expedition Map is a 1-mana artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice Expedition Map, search your library for a land, reveal it and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So you can just go and grab, it's usually, the targets are usually Phyrexian Tower, so you have a repeatable instant speed sack outlet. Or if you're sort of a little bit short on cards, or you need some removal and you need to dig for it, you'll want to grab Fomori Vault, which, provided you have a decent amount of artifacts in play. For more Revolt reads, tap to add colourless, and you can pay 3, tap, discard a card, which isn't really much of a disadvantage because your commander can play artifacts from the graveyard. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control. Put one of those cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this can grab you the card you need most in the top, usually sort of 3, 4, 5 cards of your deck, and it can be a really sort of useful utility piece that, you know, these land tutors kind of allow you to set up. I did think about having the Cabal Coffers and the Yawgmoths. I can't remember its name, but that well-known combo. But I just thought this was a little bit more. I don't want this deck to be sort of stupidly strong, but I want it to be competitive. And I found in testing that these two were useful and helpful tutors to have in a deck that runs, you know, it's a mono black deck. It runs some quite strong lands, so that's what they're for. And then finally, just talking about some win cons. The deck plays 8 of them. It plays quite a lot of card draw and card selection, as we saw earlier in the video. So I kind of think 8 win cons. A lot of them need another piece to work effectively, with probably the exception of Grey Merchant and Exsanguinate, I think there. Yeah, you could argue Bolas' Citadel just can kind of win the game on the spot, but certainly these two are perhaps the most independent of the win cons. They're generally here to gain loads of life, usually with Grey Merchant, right? You know, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, 3 and 2 black. When if a 2/4 creature zombie, when Grey Merchant of Asphodel enters, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. So, you know, if your devotion to black is 5 and each opponent loses 5 life, you gain 15 life. So that, in combination with Enduring Tenacity, you know, you hit everyone for 5, and then with Enduring Tenacity in play, whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Someone loses 15, and you can just sort of snipe people from wherever. I should have Peer into the Abyss tagged here. I don't know why I haven't. I'll fix that later. But I also wanted a sort of more alternate kind of win con here. Psychosis Crawler is a cool artifact that I always try and shoehorn into decks. This deck does draw a lot of cards, and it does so by design, so that's kind of why it's here. It's also kind of expensive at 5 mana, so the plan is usually to get this in the graveyard and pay 5 life to get it into play, and then fire off a Peer into the Abyss, which should be around here. Yeah, where target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life. So, you know, if you're on 10 life, you pay 5 life to draw 30 cards, hit everyone for 30. That's, you know, it's an artifact based win con, probably more artifact based perhaps than you know, a Grey Merchant and you know, something to recur it, like a Malakir Rebirth or something. But I like that diversity of win cons in there. It's not just Exsanguinate for the win, right? There's a bit of diversity in there, and I think certainly making this into a life gain deck where you get loads of life, which kind of works as ramp as well, and it's kind of your way of winning. It creates a deck where Anrakyr certainly pushes you towards using life as a resource. And I found before this was really a life gain deck that you'd kind of just get your life total really low, and you'd have a good board state, but it wouldn't be quite good enough to kill all the other opponents. And it kind of, you know, you'd be on 10 life trying to figure out what to do next. But having your life as a resource really front and center of this deck really kind of increased the amount of things it could do. And it kind of creates an interesting economy for the deck, wherein any sort of gain of life can be damage, it can be ramp, it can be, I guess, card draw if you count Bolas' Citadel, right? So it really becomes this kind of overarching currency that the deck really just is quite, on one hand, is quite hungry for, but also rewards you quite well for. So they're all the exemplar cards I wanted to talk to you about. I'm going to move on to the next section now, which is basically just talking about some interesting interactions that the deck puts together. Okay, so the first interaction that I want to talk about is kind of a bit of a general one, really, but it's the interaction between Roaming Throne, which is a 4 mana for an artifact creature golem. It's a 4/4. It has Ward 2, and it reads, as this card enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. This card is the chosen type in addition to its other types. If a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So it doubles up your triggered abilities essentially for the chosen type. Now, if we look here on the sort of creature type indicator that Moxfield has, really useful. You can see that the 10 Necrons and that your commander is a Necron generally points to Necron as being a really useful choice here. Getting 2 instances of this ability, particularly if you've padded out your life total quite nicely, feels pretty great. However, the interaction I wanted to draw your attention to was that if you have a sack outlet, you can sacrifice Roaming Throne and look at the creature cards you have in play and just choose which ones you wanted to double up, right? So you might want to, I don't know, name zombie, right? And your opponent's might be like, why is this person naming zombie? He doesn't have any zombies in play. And you sacrifice Roaming Throne, you attack with Anrakyr, you bring it back into play for 4 life, you choose zombie, your opponent say, what is going on? And then you play a Grey Merchant and you double up its ETB trigger essentially, and you just gain loads of life, and you probably win the game at that point, right? But there are other things you can do. You could choose Snake and double up Enduring Tenacity. You could do a range of different things. Generally, Necron is the best one to choose, but there are other choices out there for you to think about. I thought that was a really sort of utility kind of functionality that the deck permits through essentially the fact that it can sacrifice and replay its artifacts quite efficiently. So that's the first one I wanted to draw your attention to. The second interaction that I want to mention also includes Roaming Throne, but it's more focused on Technomancer, in that essentially you can cast Buried Alive, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery that reads, search your library for up to 3 creature cards, put them into your graveyard, then shuffle. So I really like casting this on turn 3 and putting Technomancer, Tryout Praetorian, and Roaming Throne into the graveyard. And then when you attack with Anrakyr, you essentially play Technomancer for 7 life, which enters mills 3, and then you return artifact creature cards with mana value 6 or less. So you choose Tryout Praetorian and Roaming Throne. These 2 will enter at the same time, and essentially when Roaming Throne enters the battlefield, you can choose a creature type. In this instance, I like to choose Necron, and that basically means that Tryout Praetorian triggers twice. So because you stack the triggers, so Tryout Praetorian essentially resolves afterwards, and you get 2 instances of drawing 2 and losing 4. It feels like a nice sort of bursty draw kind of situation, and then from there, the deck can quite feasibly sacrifice Technomancer, and then replay it with Anrakyr, and then you get all of Technomancer's triggered abilities doubled. So you mill 3 and return 6 mana value artifact creatures from graveyard to battlefield twice, which just feels amazing. That feels really sort of loads of value and lots of interesting things happening. I've done that once in a game and it was really, really cool. Would totally recommend. So yeah, that's the second cool interaction I wanted to draw your attention to. And the final one involves Triskelion. It involves Steel Overseer, and it involves Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So essentially the situation you want to set up here is that you have a Triskelion in the graveyard, and Triskelion reads, it's 6 mana. When it enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it, remove a +1/+1 counter from Triskelion. It deals 1 damage to any target. So what you want to do is Triskelion's in the graveyard. You want to exile it with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which could trigger Immotech ability if that card's in play. And then once you have Triskelion exiled under Agatha's Soul Cauldron, this ability, remove a +1/+1 counter from Triskelion. It deals 1 damage to any target. Essentially becomes an activated ability that Agatha's Soul Cauldron, right? Creatures with +1/+1 counters have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. This essentially means that all creatures with +1/+1 counters on them can remove a +1/+1 counter from the creature to deal 1 damage to any target. So every time you put a +1/+1 counter on an artifact creature you have, with a Steel Overseer, for instance, they all kind of represent 1 instance of extra damage. So you can kind of machine gun or turret down all the threats on the board or one particular problematic opponent in a really sort of cool. You can kind of hold the board hostage essentially. And take someone out of the game if they try and remove it, because you can just remove all the +1/+1 counters from all 5 of your creatures, and there's 2 of them on each, and you just do 10 damage to someone out of nowhere, right? And that just kind of takes them out of the game, and then their removal doesn't work, right? So there's a really cool interaction there that you can set up. It's kind of unlikely, you need a lot of pieces in place for this to work. If you have a Whip of Erebos in play and they all have lifelink as well, the instances of 1 gain you 1 life, which I think is really sort of thematic and on point for the deck. But it is, there are several pieces to get into play, sort of 3 or 4 card combos that I think are, feasible if you're able to, for instance, Buried Alive for 2 of those pieces, and you just happen to draw Agatha's Soul Cauldron. But it's a really cool board state that the deck can produce. And it's certainly a fun one in that sense. Okay, so that is essentially the deck tech. I've been through the aims of the deck, what it's trying to achieve in the early game, the mid game, and the late game. Just to kind of recap, turn 1 to kind of 4 really. You want to be playing utility pieces, so mana rocks, Warlock class style effects, Ransack the Lab style effects that are getting cards in the graveyard and lands to hand, so you can play your commander in a timely fashion. You then want to be playing in the mid game sort of 6 mana Caged Sun, Immortal Sun style artifacts for 6 life instead of 6 mana to make sure you can attack subsequent turns with your commander, and then kind of finishing the game off with some sort of iteration of Grey Merchant into Enduring Tenacity. Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, is a notable include that I don't have on here, just because I somehow never managed to get one. And I think that probably having another instance of Enduring Tenacity's ability, whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, I do think that would kind of add a bit of redundancy to the deck and just make it win a little bit more consistently. As it happens, I've kind of gone with other pieces. I'm looking at you, Crashing Drawbridge. But this does kind of help make the Anrakyr turn, in inverted commas, take place a little bit more smoothly. So that's the deck. I'm interested to hear what anyone who sees this thinks of the deck. I've tried to keep it multifaceted, but focused and interesting in a way that it's not just a generically good artifact deck that wins with Aetherflux Reservoir top and Bolas' Citadel style combos. I did think about putting Aetherflux Reservoir in here, but I don't love 4 mana artifacts that don't really do anything the turn they come down. Obviously, Aetherflux is way better than that. It probably has won a lot of people a lot of games, and I do think I'll try it in this deck. Obviously, it's an artifact. It gains life. It's very thematic. Probably more thematic than some of the other stuff I have in here. But I don't have one. Maybe I'll get one soon and try it out. But that's what the deck's trying to do. Really interested to hear what you think about it. Any cards I've missed, like Aetherflux Reservoir, it's like, Will, what are you doing? It's so on point. You need to have this in your deck. You've got Triskelion in there, like you may as well as have a Aetherflux or what other various cards that you think would benefit the deck. That's the deck tech. Looking forward to hearing what you think. Thanks, guys.